Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be coming back here. You know, I used to be a terribly spoiled child growing up in Luxembourg, which had been destroyed by a war and which had survived the Rundstedt offensive. I was born like 6 months later, and so it was this kind of a massacre and unbelievable destruction which in a way gave us 60 or 70 years of peace, but very bad architecture. Blissfully, Luxembourg was reconstructed by very conservative architects who had not yet been caught up with modernism. They were a bit behind, but in a way it went very well. And some of the places that people think are historic places in Luxembourg are in fact originated between 1945 and 1955. People think it's historic. New urbanism from traditional architecture is not an architecture of the past, but of our condition, which is permanent. And you know, when I sent a brief to Ken, he said, concentrate. Don't talk about fossil fuels. Concentrate on the human scale, because it's clearly what is interesting architecture and town planning. What is the scale to which we should build despite our machine equipments? Because it was very, really the basis for the loss of scale, of human scale in cities. If you look at the theoreticians of modernism, the main motivation was because we have machines, we have to really rethink the scale of our cities. And everything has to be dictated according to that machine scale. Whereas our theory is that whatever machines we use, we should really know this human scale. And I am going to talk about that today. It's a rather refined subject which goes beyond, the first lesson of architecture. But one of the problems is that one has always to give the first lesson because architecture has been so ignored by general education, that one has always to come back to the foundational principles and so on. Now, we live in a world where there's a lot of conventions, but most of them have been lost in architecture. That technological development is actually tradition-bound, and there is no revolutions in technology. You go on, you try, you test, and then you return, and there's constant reference to the past. And I think the mythology of progress has particularly been damaging in architecture. But this started fairly long time ago. For instance, this building, you think it's a monastery with a cathedral in this ecclesiastical style, yet it's a house for a very rich man in the mid of England. And now this is not a mosque, but it is a technical building for technical equipment for pumping house, for bringing water to the fountains of Sanssouci in Potsdam. And of course then the reaction against this success, which was generalized already in the 19th century. Now, what should mosques look like if you build technical buildings like that? Or what should churches look like if that is a house and that is a living room which was exactly under the tower? There was this extraordinary excess going on, where just a residential apartment building in Geneva would display an entire history of architectural form on a simple residential building. Now imagine you build entire towns, churches, stables, everything is high-tuned architecture, then again this kind of excess. There was an extreme reaction just after World War I, and I'm not speaking about the lack of talent. I only show images of the most talented architects of the period. But it was really preparing, it was this extreme reaction against the excess of form and decoration which led to modernism. Which finally, and you would never guess, but this was a great architect called Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Was the most important German architect who emigrated in 1938 to the US because Hitler didn't offer him good jobs. And he designed the campus for the Illinois Institute of Technology, and this was the church. So what should warehouses look like if churches look like, this way? And that was, of course, you all know the Pompidou Center in Paris, which brought in this incredible revolution of so-called revolution in architecture, which changed France. So the question is again, what would oil refineries or technical buildings who process things without humans look like if that is a cultural palace? Which is still today, the model in France for cultural buildings. So, this is the confusion into which I was born, grew up that way. And but I had as an experience growing up in this beautiful city of Luxembourg, which worked perfectly. There were no slums, and it was a completely traditional city. And it was a small capital of 70,000 people, which had very grand buildings, fantastic landscape. Everything was perfect. There was no reason to make a revolution. Yet I became a revolutionary. I read Le Corbusier and I made a project where Luxembourg would be cut up by gigantic buildings and so on. But then I had my second thoughts. And I began to see who could actually do something for Luxembourg which would not demolish it. And most architects were not prepared for carrying after traditional cities. So I grew up my own theory and became actually very popular in the United States. Not in Luxembourg or in France. And it's the most striking effort to go from that idea that traditional architecture is not something historic. Because when I went to university, very briefly it was still taught, but as a history subject. This is what we did in the past, and now you have to forget all about that. It's modernism, it's something completely different. The defining phenomenon in traditional architecture was that you build according to climate, soil, altitude, and that produce an enormous variety of vernaculars around the world. And actually what unites these vernaculars is not often the region, but the altitude. You find similar buildings in Himalaya or the Basque Mountains in the Alps, whereas the buildings in the plains are often very similar. But they are thousands or 10,000 kilometers apart. So really the defining fact is climate and altitude. Now it is only the processing of building materials by fossil fuels, energies which allow to create synthetic materials, which allow to build forms which are conditioned in such a way that you could ignore completely the soil, the vegetation, and the climate. So our principle is whatever is possible, we should always have these parameters, because they are parameters which will be as long with mankind as it will exist. Whereas the energies, sources will change radically as they have changed over the last millennia. And so the idea of architectural tuning is really complement to an instrument, which under André Douany, the principal theoretician of new urbanism, has elaborated, which is called the urban transect, which defines building typology and even massing. You analyze collective buildings, you categorize it from the rural to the very urban. It's a very practical instrument to classify settlement and then reorder it and find an order which is appropriate for this geography. Architectural tuning was an essay I wrote for the Prince of Wales for the publications of his institute. How far this new form of typological reading of the theory could be linked to an architectural language and to values? It's a rather refined subject, but I think it concerns everyone, because it's finally that which decides how cities are going to grow and mature. And I've been working on the Prince of Wales main town planning project, which is called Poundbury in Dorset, and which has now been building for 25 years. We built about 50% already, and in order to understand the term of tuning, it comes from musical instruments, but in order to tune, you need already an instrument, and you need a form which makes sense, tuning fork, which allows you to really bring the instruments, sing and create harmonious sound. Now, in order to understand what that means, when you look at the tuner, he generally overstretches the string and then comes down to the actual attempt to tune. I do that with my students. They have to take an object and then they have to modify it, changing the diameter, the vertical dimensions, so you get exactly the same composition. And it's by modulating these different dimensions that you completely change the expression. It goes from, let's say, classical, and once you try these extremes, you begin to understand what does it mean, classic. A classical form is that which rests, which is correct. It's by changing the dimensions that you actually change character, and now you go from the sublime to the grotesque and so on. You can also completely recompose it. I mean, you use exactly the same elements, and this is generally the condition when you try classicism nowadays, which an industry don't understand, the terms nor the forms nor the logic, that you end up by doing buildings which are composed this way. And because there is general ignorance of these fineries, many people are prepared to buy a house which is full of these mistakes. It will end up by making a book at your house, right? showing how it's done properly, and then this makes it easier to understand. Because now in architecture, the terms of vernacular and classical are well used and understood. The vernacular building is generally to do with building forms which are technical, using materials which can be carried by one or two persons or very few machines in the traditional sense. To build forms which are stable, which form either a wall, a column, and so on, there's no expression other than to purpose, which it is meant to make a wall or a room or a window, but without any expression, without character really. Character comes through intent. Whereas classical architecture, which, and this is independent culture, whether you go to China or South America, they are the same phenomena. The classical architecture is using exactly the same elements, of which there are many more than I draw here. But as a principle, and to make them into artistic statements, which have to do with giving them character, this clearly cannot be a doghouse. This clearly cannot be a doghouse. There is a form, there is art, there is an art form. And classicism is about an art of building. It's not about an art of expressing something about your mother or about your love. It's about art of giving expression to building elements. So it's a language of building, an artistic language of building. Now, and this ends up by having a vernacular culture and a monumental culture. Culture for public buildings and a culture for private buildings. And now in this instrument I introduced the distinction. Also in town planning, when you look at the city which has grown over many centuries, they say it's medieval. Medieval planning sort of. But medieval planning, it's not straight. Whereas this could be considered as Euclidean geometry, this more classical geometry, but classicism is very much associated with that. And vernacular would be this free when you have hillside towns and so on, but this has nothing to do with Middle Ages. It has nothing to do with Middle Ages. Whatever we do, if you walk along, you create the track, and there are many people walking along the track over years, avoiding puddles and so on. It will eventually always be that way. The straight line never comes about by simple use. It is an artistic intent. It is an intellectual intent. It is to do with artistic and intellectual culture. It's not natural. It doesn't exist in the natural. Whereas this natural, you find it in mud puddles which dry, they form these interesting blocks of dry mud. So it's very close to real nature, this. And this is artificial nature, second nature, created by a man. Now often classicism is associated with this, but I think it's a mistake. It's actually a historiographic mistake, whereas the most interesting classical compositions are really those which mix vernacular and classical in a very elaborate way, very sophisticated way. Now this very simple illustration of this monastery in Venice, where you have classical architecture of the church and the vernacular of the residential wing. And it is actually those two languages, one purely of construction and one of artistic expression, in order to give special sense, this more for the private and this more for the public collective. Now what is bigger than everything and grander, which transcends the individual and individual interest. And now clearly traditional cities are built that way that you have a lot of vernacular making the streets and squares being used for everyday purposes, for work, for the economy, and then symbolic buildings of the community or of whatever it's civic or religious, which form the classical architecture. The marriage of these two which I think form the most powerful and mature urban ensembles. Now I'm going through some illustration which make it very clear, because it's for everyday use. It's for everyone. There's not a sophisticated construction. It's extremely rudimentary. It's not high-tech. It's not high-tech. It's easily understandable. And when you look at traditional cities, whether it's Paris or whatever, you generally have the tourist maps. They illustrate the vernacular by simple imprint, two-dimensional imprint of a plan. Because that is what interests the private realm. Whereas the public buildings, the churches, and so on, are often illustrated in 3 dimensions. And this really is the subject of architecture, and that is the subject of vernacular. Very simple. Easy to understand. But these categories have been completely overhauled by modernism, which claim that because there are new conditions of industrial production of synthetic materials, we must adopt these new materials in order to create architecture of our time. Architecture should not be of our time. It should transcend our time, because it has to be for use to many, many, many generations, and not just for the next ones. So we go here from vernacular constructions like animal architecture to classicism, which was, the Chicago World Fair. Fantastic. Unbelievable. Delirious classicism. Briefly constructed by the White City in Chicago. But the greatest architects of our time, of their time. But they were also in declaration of war against the Victorian confusion. It was really a statement of high classicism, but to such a degree that it was very difficult to sustain at that level of quality for more than, let's say, 1.5 generations. And it ended up with World War I, and then there were some survivors, but then completely delegitimized the system after World War II. And now I think how much classicism and vernacular do you need for happiness, huh? That's what I ask myself. How much classicism and vernacular do you need for happiness? When you look at the best cities in the world, as the best balance between architecture and vernacular, obviously in Europe it might be Venice, and where you have often the good city. It's basically, like a good cake. It's a lot of dough and then some fruits, which make it really interesting, because it leads inevitably to digestive problems of our spiritual mind, and people cannot sustain this kind of excellence of over a long period of time. And this contrast of vernacular and classicism is a constant with anything worth talking about, and of course, as we are not longer used to it. The extraordinary powers we gain through the use of coal and petrol has also made us drunk in the spiritual sense. James Kunstler says that we are really drunk on fossil fuel. We are so powerful, we can do so many great things that our mind is not able to control this kind of things anymore. And when you start doing classicism, of course, you can't get this right straight away. But this fact that, if this would be the traditional condition where the vernacular, relatively small buildings, functional buildings for agricultural production, small, and the temples for, grander symbolic buildings for the Republic or whoever. It's not only larger because it's larger. It needs an art in order not to be crude. Because if you inverse the system, if the classes become smaller, it becomes midget. It becomes mini golf type decoration. It becomes mean, and this becomes gross. So it's very important that these two sizes, these two scale differences are also treated. Now you see these enormous hotels often in the Alps, where you have a cottage in a palace size. It's a cottage, but a palace-size, big cottage. Or you have palaces, but cottage size. But there's a reason why palaces should be grand and cottages should be modest. And you know, I lived for a long time in the small town, you know, which is very picturesque, but there's almost no architecture. There's just a few columns in the church and the rest is just walls and a bit of some decoration, and it's absolute paradise. Architecture and urban paradise. So I think that this is an ideal condition where you have a lot of vernacular and then some buildings are distinguishing. When you have small ensembles, you can virtually do without architecture. Villages can be without architecture, without becoming boring, because you have mountains, you have trees, you have something which really establishes the beauty. But when you have large cities, you need something more of art in order to make it bearable. And this led to the extraordinary excess which we had either in Chicago or with Victorian building, where everything, even the teapot, had to be a masterwork. And yeah, we now fall back with laughter, but these people took it extremely seriously, because without a teapot like that, people would have been not happy. Everything had to be over-decorated and so on. So, you know, this one has to see what is actually the ideal balance, which not make architecture so important that it will be rejected or become a subject for revolution. Now let's see this extremes. You all know the St. Patrick's in the Fifth Avenue, and this very painful feeling. It's very painful feeling to have this rather grand cathedral in the shade of this rather bland and poor building. That I call private imperialism. Obviously, the over-dominance of the private over the public, and then you have this, let's say, Soviet or Nazi classicism, which has this enormous monument where everything is public, and then you have no more public, actually. Public imperialism. Or that was the Lenin Congress, Soviet Congress Palace with Lenin 400 meters high, you know, just enough to be happy. Now the interesting thing comes when you mix vernacular architecture and classical architecture with classicism, classical and vernacular buildings and urbanism. You would have here a grid with very rigorous straight lines meeting on crossings and forming relatively square box for this kind of urban geometry. You need very special architecture, which is not vernacular. Vernacular wouldn't be enough to make it bearable. Because when vernacular is so exposed on straight lines, it becomes extremely boring. Now, because you see everything at once and you see often the poverty, whereas when you have very picturesque town planning purely with vernacular, it can often be charming. Because there's so many picturesque views and you never see to the end of one street, and it's a very rich experience. I identified, mixing these two, urbanism and architecture, and then vernacular and classical, what is classical or vernacular, and then you mix this with vernacular urbanism and classical urbanism. Mixtures. And these are the 9 categories in which you can mix these 4 or 6 elements, and it's very interesting when you travel around the world, in whatever region you are, you can always fit a building, you can fit them into one of these categories. So it's not only an instrument for analyzing situations where you live or what you visit, but particularly for town planning. And so the question is, for planning a new situation, which is the most appropriate for where? For what purposes? For what geography? When you have this Euclidean, very urban, rigid order, what is very inappropriate is to have vernacular architecture. Euclidean with vernacular architecture. It's what we call barracks architecture. Barracks. Because there's kind of uniformity to it. And it can be amusing when you have a great mixture of uses, but gets particularly unbearable when there is single use occupying in that poor architecture. Now, there are some ground conditions how to make a city or what to avoid, and a mixed use is an absolutely necessary condition. Mixed use, allowing any form of economy where community lives for any uses. So you should be able to reach them without the use of artificial vehicles. And it's a territory with not more than 70 or 80 acres in which you should find your shops, your everything, and your work impossible. And it is now, except for some very large use like factories, you know, with or something that can be, you know, like an airport, very large energy plants. Most production which is now performed in our countries can be fitted into office type development. And actually the control of emissions in these factories is often more severe than the emissions which are produced by suburban homes. You know, suburban homes are extremely toxic. Makes more noises than most factories. So mixed use is foundational, because if you put mixed use on one large landliner, as I call it, one large landliner, it's not a city, it's just a building with many, many uses. But it's not the city. A city needs to be done of separate buildings, of separate uses, and mixed in such a way that they would make really good townscape. So I think this is a kind of ideal where you have a mix of functions and symbols which through their architectural expression make a language which is evident to everybody. You don't have to explain it. And throughout the 19th century, there were, for cities like Paris with extremely rigorous controls. But I think this leads to an artificial kind of boredom. So you can have the most diverse, you can have the temple, commercial buildings, all to the same building height, and you put the cross on the roof just to signify that it is a church. But it's not enough to make a nice city. And this is overordained, bureaucratic boredom, bureaucracy-induced boredom. Another situation which I think should be avoided is mixed use in completely wild, anarchic, disordered, I mean, you know, I think this is the ideal to achieve, and I think the seaside comes very close to it. And it will take a long time to realize this. 20, 30 years. But finally, you know, Robert is tuning this every day. This right, this wrong, this appropriate, this not. And except for some protesters, it's a very large agreement for the ones who live there. Excuse me. You know, it's a very big loss for it's a very large agreement for those who live there and the people who choose to visit and so on. But it's an enormous success with young people. You know, it's the language which works. Everyone understands. God damn, it works. But Seaside was meant for, you know, to be for all people. And now it has become a trend. Because it is a language which is universal to humans. If you have the same mix of use, misapplied architecture, you have suddenly the modest part becomes, you know, monumental, and the chapel is just reduced to a doghouse and so on. You see what I mean. It's a very interesting instrument to read. But then also when all this becomes architecture, every small corner, even the toilets are decorated, it becomes terribly boring. Becomes boring, and well, you know, the language will die. Now, if we go over to urbanism to see what happens to this kind of sprawl, and I call this vertical sprawl, because this is horizontal cul-de-sac. It is inevitably, it causes geographic congestion. And this is vertical cul-de-sac's only way in and out, you know, always congested. And I think these things should be avoided. There's enough propaganda about them. And that's why we choose to promote the opposite model. Because this is what is taught in architectural schools, and this is the system which doesn't need any ideological defense. It's there whether you like it or not. Whereas, the traditional model needs a lot of articulation. There are only 2 schools in the US which teach it, and in Europe there is none. Everything we do is wrong. But what we do is enormous effort. We are really wasting an incredible occasion to do good cities. Why? Why? But you know, I know, and I think the wheel is turning. You know, we did something wrong, and then what to do, how to put it right. It's not an easy job. But basically, we have been repeating the skyscraper, the suburban home, and so on in very large quantities in monofunctional zones by excessive amounts of same use. And this kind of zoning has now shaped the economy, the society, and to build an alternative model takes a lifetime. Like Robert to build Seaside, it takes a lifetime. Which doesn't respond to any sorts of these types, but really makes a meaningful language which will survive us all, I think. So traditional building is built to mature in size and shape and then multiply. Go over to a novel town, a Neustadt, Villeneuve. You have this concept, whereas the last 100 years have been vertical overexpansions and horizontal overexpansions, all due to excessive disposability of fossil fuels. Now, when you look at the property sizes like traditional towns, like medieval or whatever, they were made in proximity of very large differences of sizes and character, which would form an urban neighborhood around finely shaped squares and streets and mixing often income and races in whatever the ideal situation. Well, let's say it's a dream, or it's not a dream, huh? But it's an instrument. It's an instrument which transcends political differences and allows to build the civitas. You know, the civitas, the public space where the differences of economy and race and beliefs have an instrument where to meet in a common space. A natural place to meet and live their rivalries in civilized manner. And this is what urban shaping is about. You have done through the last 3-4 centuries an extraordinary growth of building lots, and finally in totalitarian states or now in modern developments, you had the enormous building lots for single use, which would often the size of 2 or 3 traditional towns. And of course, when you are an architect, what do? You get this to build in such an area, 1 million square feet for university. What do as one single architect? You get bored. You draw the same, you repeat 5 same windows ever so often. It's preordained boredom. Architectural boredom. What happens then if you're bored? You go nuts. You become Frank Gehry. You become Frank Gehry. You can't stand it. You make crazy buildings which are supposed to be interesting, but they should be interesting because of their use and their forms. They generate different forms which create language. Imagine now a whole town designed like Frank Gehry. I mean, yes, sometimes interesting buildings, but you cannot conceive an entire town, a planet built that way. It's impossible. And so it's certainly, excuse me, but it's certainly not a model to admire. And it's clearly admired enough. You can find it amusing, but certainly not a way to build cities. And now you find this excess of scale throughout the last 200 years. There are traditional towns, whether it's Paris, or they all had human scale. And I don't speak about human scale as something sentimental. It's human like our trousers are human because they are adapted to our body. It's a matter of dimension, which is comfortable and can produce good forms. So throughout the 19th, 20th century, totalitarian models, or Corbusier, fine mad city with 3 million people, where everything is completely disembodied by mechanical systems of transportation and so on. So what we are talking about here is a pedestrian city. We use vehicles, but in a modest sense, when it's necessary, not because we are forced to. So it's that we have to limit urban neighborhoods, or traditional neighborhoods as they are called here, to about 70 acres, 30 hectares horizontally and vertically, to 3 to 5 floors. Because that's what you can walk as a sane person 20 times a day. And it's very good for, it's very good for exercise, 100 steps and up and down. If I could make one law, I would make a law that should not allow you to build higher than 3 floors. Nowhere. Nowhere more than 3 floors. Societies will adapt to it. That's what cities were like. And the economy will be shaped according to it. When you impose 3 floors, you will end up with 5, because 1 cannot just stop. You cannot just stop at 1 floor. This is complete madness. This was the first major crisis which will hit us. It will hit us in our lifetime. The system will collapse in a dramatic ways, and these are the presidential issues. It's not just for architects for fun. It is really the choice between suburban promotion of sprawl or promotion of community-sized cities. So that's the model of the last 200 years. This is a small town, grows bigger and bigger and forms enormous sprawl, leading to excess amount of transport inside, outside. In Guatemala City, every day 2 million people are traveling in and out in this small historic center. Everybody goes mad sitting in polluting congestion 4 hours. So where is the model of the future? The model of the future must be, that a large metropolis is a family of small cities with the reduced amount of mechanical transport, or a very large commonwealth of small cities spread according to geography and natural resources. This is the model of our future. But it will take us generations to get there. And that's really trying to imitate nature in a healthy growth. It's always multiplication of cells. Whereas one of the definitions of sickness is the excessive growth of single cells destroying the carrying system. And I will now illustrate this with one project. We did for Prince of Wales. We have now built it with a polycentric instead of a single center. As these town walls are going towards a polycentric situation, you see. It's now vernacular geometry, but with very modest architecture, central square and radiating streets. And you don't get the whole picture, but that was meant to be a church, but became an office block because there are already too many churches in towns. But anyways, you can't always get everything. Why do polycentric city with modest heights? Creates only monofunctional boredom, enormous social divisions, excessive real estate values in the center, and then they spread outwards, the division, the zoning of societies. In Colombia, for instance, the rich live in the tower block, the poor live in the slums up the hill, and they never meet, they don't meet. There's no space for them to meet. So the civitas, the model of societies, is fantastic, and I think transcends any metaphysical belief. I think it's the model which we have to return to, so that the size, the horizontality, verticality, the core or lack of core make a language we understand. I don't have to explain it to you, you already know. This is evident to everyone. That's what we planned. The precedent is impossible. The Prince of Wales is gone mad, he's an idiot. And this is what is built, and people who visit, they think it's historic. It's modern, it's 20 years old. These are new, and we finally, after 20 years after training craftsmen, we get very good quality of building. We have great architects doing this, we train them. And we have a ball, because they're extremely cheap to build. So we limit building heights to metric heights, which leads to architectural repetitiveness and also compels builders to build as many low floors as possible, limiting envelope. Whereas when you say 3 floor height or 5 or 1 height limit, you can, get a great variety of building heights. According to the famous campanile of Giotto in Florence, it's a 5-story high building, but 100 meters high until you have it. And Eiffel Tower is, 3 stories, 3 floors high, but You know, it's a skyscraper. And the Capitol building in Washington is one-story high skyscraper. It dominates not only Washington, it dominates American politics. And so what would Washington be without this building? Just a single-story high building, and so on. So in a way, the meaningfulness of the monumental potency of a building augments as you reduce the number of floors in a relationship to the volumetric expression. Now, when you build a traditional town, it becomes such a machine for improving real estate values, for improving social values, for improving civitas. You have to protect it against speculative and hostile takeovers, and the skyscraper, it's a hostile takeover and destruction of value. It can make a lot of money for a single individual, but if you go to the bitter logic of the skyscraping madness, imagine every single building lot built as a skyscraper. There can be no nightmare more unbearable than this. No? I mean, unbearable. One of the reasons why we have not only relatively small buildings, never larger than they need to be, is to employ very small builders, that we educated. All these builders we employed with 5 to 10 employees, and now they become major builders. But it's to bring the traditional forms of building with natural local materials and to train crafts on site. It's to bring back small scale enterprise. And investments which have been completely wiped out by larger, by zoning land with enormous lots where you can only develop with very large investments. This is a project in Guatemala City where a very large family, this is in the center and these are the properties of the royal family. It's over several kilometers long and we are building, this is now finished, we're just nearly finished. We made this two, they're linked by a high street, there's a mall and the university, the Jesuit University Center and so on. All this building is in concrete. Concrete. No way to avoid concrete. 20 years ago, I would have resigned. But now concrete is a very good material if you use it in a proper way. And also because there are, anti-seismic laws, there has to be no way that you can build in traditional ways. Here, only concrete. But this was all built in the last 5 years. So you don't need thousands of years to build a real attractive urban piece of land. This was supposed to be a restaurant, but now it's a temporary church. And after 50 years of abstinence, I even was taken by my architects there to have communion. So never too late. You have this very fine craftsmanship being developed where we avoid artwork like hell. No art in our cities. No art. Because when an art is so bad, you don't need it. We don't need art if it's bad art. We have good buildings. We have some fountains and that's it. And but this craftsmanship, it will come back because all this training of crafts also trains talents which are naturally born. When you have young people and they find their ways into these crafts, you find all these vocations are suddenly coming back. This vocation which was supposed to be dead and matter of the past, traditional building, and many people, modernists, artists, architects think it's too simple of a thing. It's a house. It's not just windows and doors and roofs. But this is all a house is about. It is just, the doors and windows and roofs. It is very sophisticated, but it's not natural. Nothing like this exists in nature. But in order to protect this artifice against erosion, that you have a roof. It is not a matter of style, and reinventing the house is not only useless, but a ridiculous exercise. It's ridiculous to imitate. And it will be quickly forgotten. What we have to struggle with is fake, it's fakeness. Most of the building now, which look traditional, is in fact fake. Doesn't stand up to inspection. And it is that we have to struggle with. And why universities should at least have one faculty teaching traditional crafts and traditional construction and language. Now this is my favorite. This is a very large building complex I did with my brother in Luxembourg. My brother proposed a big palace for justice, and I proposed the little city, which was finally built, and in a way each different branches would meet, form like a small town built on this rock in Luxembourg City. I gave up after 7 years of struggling with the Luxembourg bureaucracy, but my brother went on for another 7 years to build it. And it became such an object of hatred for architects, so much so that it polluted the media even in such a way that my sister was stopped in a street by a friend who said, "Mariam, tell me, why can't your brothers be modern?" And a person is not an architect. It's nothing to do with architecture, but the media. It's in fact very pleasant. It fits very well into the historic townscape of Luxembourg. And now there is a very big project that I did for the mayor of Rome, who has not been voted out, but was to reform a very large 30,000 inhabitant slum outside of Rome. Unspeakable ugliness. But the mayor of Rome, then he said we have to reconstruct the metropolis in a polycentric fashion, adopting these meta-political aspects of planning to rebuild communities so that you do not have single center and the suburbs, but that the Rome again becomes polycentric situation. Because he had done the study of how much different classes of citizens spend in time and money and traveling to and from their work. And it's absolutely catastrophic for the lower class. It's unsustainable for a long period of time. But he lost the elections, and yet... excuse me. I did not know this is unstable. Excuse me. It's great this happened, you know what? Because it comes with turbulence. Because this mayor... he lost the elections, and he is now investigated by the mafia. Mafia in this falls. Maybe I shouldn't say that anymore. And it was to transform this suburb, this cul-de-sac. This would become a town of 44,000 people of 4 different quarters and basically done by the private industry. And this would help rebuild the slum. 18 towers would come down, 60 slabs. This one is holy ground. We couldn't touch it. But that's the view. This is the holy ground. This is the holy ground. And this is the new quartier. And I adopted all these small blocks. But this is what it looked like. But we faced extremely hostile developers and intellectuals. University even organized a seminar against it to save this slum because it's considered as historic, They consider this slum as historic. And this is the aspect of lots of private and public uses mixed with schools and the town hall and public square, the market building, fountains, everything which is nice in the center of Rome would be exported into the suburbs. And of course, this would also attract probably also tourism and hotels, public buildings. And every one of this palazzina is also a penthouse. It would be the most agreeable form of urban living. But now, not a single image of these renderings was published in Italy. And I used to be one of the most published architects in Italy for like 30 years. Not one of these images was published in one single professional paper. And so that's why I believe in conspiracy theories now. Thank you.